Welcome, everyone. I'm Shannon Blady, and I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the Louisiana Children's Museum. We are very excited to host our In Dialogue series. This is a new series that's going to highlight some issues with mental health and connecting to parents and caregivers and educators to discuss tips that impact our children. Today, we're honored to have Dr. Devi Miron-Murphy. She's a licensed psychologist and associate professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Tulane University. Dr. Murphy has actually hosted and facilitated some of our In Dialogue series before, so we're happy to have her back. And we know that she's going to be here for another one on screen time in the future. So we are hoping to have this series once a month, and we hope that you log in. And this will be recorded and put on our website so that parents can look at it later as well. So without further ado, we're going to get started. And thank you, Dr. Murphy, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
We're so happy to see you. We are going to talk about a really tough topic today. So the first question is, what is the impact of children witnessing acts of gun violence in the media?
Definitely a relevant topic for now. So believe it or not, up to about 96% of youth report having experienced some type of either witnessing community violence or having actually been a part of a shooting. So it's more common than you might think and that we might hope, but the impact can be that kids really lose their sense of safety in the world, and it sets their sense of trust off, and so they start to question whether the world is safe, whether their surroundings are safe, whether, you know, even family members who are supposed to be protecting them are safe. It can disrupt their sense of identity development. So if kids are seeing that particular groups are being targeted, if they affiliate with that particular identity, then they also may have disruptions in their own identity development.
96%. Can children be impacted by an event even if they weren't present for the event?
Definitely. So kids can learn, and adults also can learn about events obviously through the media, through social media, through just hearing stories about these events, learning about it in newspapers, and they can be impacted, especially if they're hearing, as we all are, hearing about these stories on a regular basis or being frequently exposed to content.
Are there any things that we can do to make sure they're not exposed to this content?
Definitely. So limiting exposure to media is really important. So I'm going to talk about the impact at different ages, but for young kids, we may think that our young babies and toddlers aren't listening, or they're not noticing what's on the radio when we're driving them to school, but they can definitely pick up on certain things, and it's best to sort of limit their exposure to news stories that have to do with violence. So that's in the car, that's at home with the TV. Lots of people like to have their TV on all the time. You have to really pay attention to what's on the TV. And then older kids, of course, have much more access to media without their parents' knowledge or supervision. And so we really want to monitor that and limit. We can put parental controls on media devices because kids really don't need to be exposed to violent content on a regular basis.
What are some of their common reactions when they are exposed?
Again, that differs by age. So kids up to about age 2, birth to 2, we know that they don't really have the words to put in, express how they're feeling about things or to really understand what they're seeing, but they still can be impacted. They can pick up on the stress around them. They can pick up on their parents' stress if they're learning about something, or if they, are exposed directly to an event. They can pick up on that being a very stressful situation, even though they don't fully understand it. So even young babies can be impacted. Toddlers from about ages 3, or preschool age kids from about 3 to 6 are starting to develop that language, and so they may be able to share a little bit more about what they're thinking and feeling, and they also have the ability to put their experiences into words, and so they have more of like a narrative about what happened. It may not be accurate, it may not be exactly as adults understand it, but they do have some sense of what's happened. And so we want to check in with them and see, if they how much they understand about what they've been exposed to. And then, older kids really start to question their safety again. Is this going to happen again? Is this going to happen to me? Why did this person do this? And so we want to reassure them and let them know that they're safe. And so, if they're exposed to the media, that's a little bit easier. Obviously, we can talk about maybe something happening in some other place where they're not in danger. But if it's something happening in their community, we want to really support them and support families to talk with them honestly about what's happened. Because again, they're going to have a sense that their world is not safe, that it's not safe to go to school, it's not safe to leave their parents. You may see more separation anxiety, school refusal, disruptions in sort of developmental milestones, so maybe regression, sleep disturbances, appetite disturbances. Kids who were toilet trained now, have more trouble with that, and may go into baby talk, things like that for younger children. Older kids, they may sort of get into more risk-taking behavior if they've really been impacted, sort of this sense of hopelessness, like, well, if this happened to a friend of mine, then it's going to happen to me.
Right.
And so why should I study hard, or why should I really think about the future? So older kids, if they're exposed on a regular basis to violence, they may have a real sense of hopelessness about the future, may engage in more substance use, and may end up having more anxiety and depression.
And we're seeing a lot of that too, like especially in females.
Yes.
When we're talking about this topic, we talk about PTSD and vicarious trauma. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So PTSD is a mental health disorder that can happen following a traumatic event. So an event that's particularly terrifying to a person, where there was the threat to someone's life, or there's a threat of injury to that person or somebody they know, or somebody they could witness that as well. And that is when it's diagnosed, it happens it can only be diagnosed at least a month after the event. So within the first month, everybody will typically have some type of reaction to a traumatic event. If you think about a hurricane, following a hurricane, everyone in the community is really struggling, with finding safe housing and things like that, and they may feel sad and depressed and have adjustment issues to that. But if those kinds of feelings don't get better over time, then that's when we might start thinking about a post-traumatic stress disorder. There are 4 clusters of symptoms for PTSD. So re-experiencing, talking a lot about what happened, having intrusive memories about what happened, avoidance, so trying to avoid a particular area or anything that might remind them of what happened, numbing, so sort of more emotional withdrawal, and just sense of isolation that kids can have, and also negative cognition. So again, feeling like the world is not safe, or that that they're not going to be okay participating in certain events. And then finally, hyperarousal. So kids who have PTSD can be very jumpy, they might be very anxious, sort of overactive, always on guard, always on the lookout for danger. So that's PTSD. And vicarious trauma is when the event didn't happen directly to the person, but they learned about it happening to somebody close to them, so that they still have those same symptoms and feelings, but there was not a direct exposure.
And so that the babies and toddlers might experience this a little bit differently. How would it look for a baby or a toddler?
Definitely. So there are some case studies documented in the literature, and certainly I know from my own clinical experience, that babies can experience PTSD, or at least what we think looks like PTSD. So young babies, again, they don't have the language to tell us how they're feeling, but they may have the same kind of reactions to particular events that might remind them of something scary. So they may have kind of more of a sensory memory of things. They don't really, can't express how they what their thoughts are about it, but they may start crying in response to certain reminders of events. And that diagnosis for young kids who don't have language is really based mostly on caregiver observation of their behavior. But we know that young kids can experience it. Toddlers, again, they're going to start to have more language, and so they may be able to tell us about what happened, but they often will talk about it in a very matter-of-fact way. So, someone came in and shot with a gun, very matter-of-fact, like this was kind of normal. Whereas older kids and adults realize that there was something wrong with that. Kids may just sort of repeatedly tell people, strangers in a store, that something scary happened. Or they may play it out. So they may take toys and kind of act out what they saw, and it's almost like in a driven manner, like they have to play it out, like there's a story on their mind that they really need to get out. So they sometimes will play that out. And so we know that young kids can experience PTSD. They may have those setbacks in their development. They may have new fears that were not fears before the event, like going to school. They may have more separation anxiety. So they have a lot of the same symptoms that adults have, but also maybe some other ones as well.
One of the things that we see a lot with the parents that talk to us here at the museum is, I don't know how to explain this to my child. So can you help us with what are parents supposed to say when a community event like this happens, or a violent community event happens?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, it depends on the age and development and sort of the capacity for the child to kind of take in information. So that's cognitively, but also emotionally. So for young children, it's best to be, for all kids, it's best to be honest about what happened, but you want to really simplify it based on their age. So it could just be as simple as a man went into the building and hurt people with a gun. So just a very matter-of-fact, simple, honest explanation of what happened. Young kids, they may not ask why. At younger ages, as they start to ask why, you may be able to give them a little more information. It could be something as simple as that person made a bad choice, that was not okay what they did. Those people are getting help now, or something like that. As kids get older, you can certainly give them more information. Very precocious kids, may have more complex questions about what this means for them or their loved ones or the world in general. So parents really want to monitor sort of how their kids are reacting to that, so they may be able to tolerate and understand more, but emotionally they still may be impacted. So giving sort of information in small doses is probably best. Following the child's lead in terms of what questions they have, what's really on their mind, checking in with them is good. For young kids, they don't have the memory capacity that older kids do, so they may not really realize, may not really remember what happened. So you could sort of wait until they bring it up to answer any questions. For older kids, it might be good to bring it up yourself, knowing if you think that that's on your child's mind.
What might be some signs that a child is struggling after an event? What should we be looking for?
Yeah. So again, setbacks in routine. So refusal to do certain things that they were doing before. Not even for young kids, they may have a loss of interest in just playing, going to the park, things that they really enjoy. Again, if that persists after about a month or so. And then again, kids who talk about it repeatedly, ask lots of questions, or on the other hand, seem very withdrawn or isolated. And kids who do not want to have conversations, anytime somebody brings it up, they try to change the subject, or they get really upset. That's more the avoidance kind of symptom, and so we want to pay attention to that as well. Trouble with sleeping, appetite again, and again, older kids really, they may have trouble telling us as well. They may tell us in their behavior, so really just trying to pay attention to any changes that might have happened.
Yeah. So we have these events happening all the time. how do we tell our kids that you're safe, even though they keep happening over and over again? Like, what language do we use for that?
Really difficult. Yeah, unfortunately, it seems like we're learning about an event, almost on a daily basis. And it's not easy to tell your child they're safe when, we as parents question that ourselves.
Right.
So, what we can do is really help kids feel safe within relationships. So again, when we're with them, nurturing them, letting them know it's okay to talk about these things so that they know they can come to parents and caregivers with their feelings. And letting them know that there are people in the world whose job it is to keep us safe. So for example, a lot of schools are running, active shooter drills. And oftentimes schools don't notify people or the parents before they run the drill, but they'll sometimes tell us afterwards. And it's encouraged to talk about that experience with your child, and just see how that was for them, see how they feel, see if they were, how they were feeling in the moment, how they feel now, afterwards, and notice any changes again in their behavior. But let them know that the reason for those drills is to keep us safe, keep kids and staff at the schools safe. And so there's reassurance that we may need to give regularly to children in this day and age with so many threats to our safety.
Could you speak just a little bit about, for teachers and caregivers,
Sure.
About children who may feel safe at home but are struggling a little bit with that when they go into their group care situations?
Yeah.
How teachers should handle that with the children and then also with the parents?
Sure. So when kids are kind of transitioning from their safe home environment to other places like school or anywhere outside the home, young kids, they really thrive on routine, predictability. Sometimes, any little disruption they'll pick up on. So if there's a change in the teacher in the classroom, they want to know where the teacher was and what happened, and maybe they don't want to go to school, or they realize that things are different. Trying to keep routines as consistent as possible in terms of in the morning, and then going to the child care setting. Transition objects are great for little ones, that they feel like they have this kind of safety guard with them, if it's a little stuffed animal or something. Going into the school and preparing them to let them know who's going to be there. If there is a change, parents can say, "Oh, okay, Miss So-and-so is not here today, but she'll probably be back tomorrow." And then on the receiving end, the caregivers and the teachers, again, reassuring kids that they will be picked up at whatever time. Let them know sort of the routine of the day. Have it posted somewhere so kids can know what's happening next. That sense of predictability and safety is what can be disrupted after an event like a shooting. So really helping kids realize that routines and those things hopefully will stay in place. Of course, if the community itself was who was impacted by the event, things may look different, and so we'll have to support kids through those big changes as well.
And I know that, because I have this in my own family, people who just want to distract from the topic, they really don't want to get into it. What do you suggest for talking about the topic or just distracting them from it?
Yeah. Well, distraction can be helpful at times, especially when it's not the time and place to talk about something. But in general, it's best to sort of use other ways to process something. So help the child find words and coping skills to talk about something. If kids pick up that parents or caregivers are trying to change the subject, they may get the message that it's not okay to talk about it. Mm-hmm. It's not okay to talk about what happened. It's not okay to talk about their feelings about what happened. Being able to share thoughts and feelings with caregivers and teachers really helps rebuild that sense of trust and safety, that it's okay, my experience is valid, and I'm worthy of being cared for and being heard. And so that's really important to let kids know that it's okay to talk about it. And we can help parents, again, knowing what to say, just keep it very simple. And sometimes parents and caregivers don't need to say anything. They just need to listen.
Yeah.
They just need to hear what's on their child's mind, and say, this is really hard. I know that was really scary, and you're okay now.
Listening is the most important part.
Right.
So this kind of piggybacks on that question. It's just when do we know we have given too much information? And I know it's based on their development, but at what point do we stop and say, okay, I'm not going to keep dwelling on this?
Right. I think again, following the child's lead. So are we wanting to share things because we're trying to process it? And so as caregivers, parents, we want to find other adults to process these events with, and not with children so much. But if the child changes the subject, that's probably fine to move on to something else. It doesn't necessarily mean they're avoiding their emotions. It may be that they're ready to move on and that they're okay. If that avoidance becomes a problem, like it's a reaction to the event, then we want to sort of try a different approach. But sometimes kids are just kind of done with the topic, and we need to let them move on. And if kids are preoccupied, if they're excessively worried about something, if they're bringing it up a lot, then maybe it's time to really think about how much information they're getting.
Okay. So you just mentioned this. What if we as adults are struggling after an event? What do we do?
Great question. So what we can do is check in with ourselves. So first, we may have to have compassion for ourselves, that we may also be experiencing a lot of distress. And we want to turn to our sources of support. So in the community, that may be going to vigils, going to community gatherings to honor the lives that maybe were lost in these shooting events, but also realize when we need a break. There's this acronym, PRN, pause, reset, nourish. So take a break, check in with yourself and see how you're feeling, and then do something fun, do something relaxing. Realize that, sometimes we're just giving ourselves so much information with social media, and sometimes we feel like we're just driven to kind of learn as much as we can about an event. And that really can be very overwhelming to adults as well as children. And so being sure to connect with others, but also take a break when needed, really trying to find that balance. And then if we realize that we're having symptoms of PTSD, so as adults, again, that 1 month kind of rule of thumb applies. So if we're thinking about the event repeatedly, images of it pop into our mind when we don't want them to, nightmares, avoiding certain things that remind us of the event, being always on edge, irritability, and feeling very anxious, maybe even sad and depressed, crying a lot. Those things are signals to us that something's wrong, and so we may want to seek professional help.
Yeah. So PRN, we're going to use that. Mm-hmm. And what other resources are available for us to learn about this topic and for helping kids after one of these events?
The National Child Traumatic Stress Network, nctsn.org, is my go-to resource for everything related to trauma and trauma's impact on children and caregivers in particular. So there's really a wealth of information on that website. There are several handouts that caregivers can download, that schools can download to help kids, even youth, older kids. There are handouts about how youth, do experience community violence at very high rates and what we can do. So, for example, one idea is having older kids get really involved. Sometimes they want to help with the solution. So if they're feeling more active in their communities, or maybe they want to help raise money for victims of a particular event, that gives them a sense of control back. And so there are some resources like that encourage youth to get involved in ways that they can get involved on nctsn.org. There are, community-based resources. So for therapy, there are options such as Children's Bureau. That's their sort of mission, is to help kids and families recover after a traumatic event. And there are books. So there's a wonderful author, Chandra Ghosh Ibn, who is a clinical psychologist who works specifically with children and their caregivers who have experienced trauma. She wrote a book called Argo and Me, and that's available online through Kindle. And there's a wonderful book, children's book, that's a story about how sort of a general story about trauma and how kids can experience trauma, but also how they can recover.
Okay. We have to get that for our teacher resource room over here.
That would be great. Yeah.
Is there anything else that you want to share before we wrap up our very special In Dialogue session today on this topic?
Sure. In terms of professional services, so the LSU Center for Evidence to Practice has this wonderful directory of clinicians who have been trained to provide evidence-based treatment for trauma and for PTSD and for grief. I didn't talk much about grief, but if grief is a factor, so if someone has lost someone in an event like this, certainly we want to pay attention to those feelings of grief that kind of last a long time and are complicated by trauma. But LSU Center for Evidence to Practice has a directory. You can go on it. You can search by region of the state. You can search by a particular therapy. So there are evidence-based treatments, including cognitive behavioral therapy for kids really from ages 3 all the way up to 17. Child-parent psychotherapy is also for young kids, so birth through age about 6 years, and that would be with the child and the caregiver. So those are really great therapies that are available in our community and across our state. And you can find the names of those clinicians who provide that on that website.
Perfect. We will put that on our website.
Good.
Do we have any questions? Holly is the voice that you've been hearing. She's our In Dialogue director who's monitoring Zoom for us. Anything?
Not as of right now, but I'll give it just another minute. If you guys want to wrap up, I'll see if there's any questions.
Okay.
Was there anything more specific about schools you were thinking about, or child care centers?
I know that there will be some caregivers and some teachers who will want to view this, and I know sometimes that's something that's really hard for them to navigate. So maybe if you want to speak a little bit about how do you carry out some of those same things within a group care setting where it's not just one child that you're focusing on, it may be multiple children within that group that needs that same level of attention.
Yeah, that is great. Great question. So, so how do we help teachers and caregivers who are in child care settings and schools help when it's not just one child who may be, experiencing this a trauma reaction, but a group of children? And so, yes, so kids, again, are impacted differently by events, and they display how they're impacted differently. So that can be a real challenge in those settings. So thank you for bringing that up. We want to, again, encourage caregivers to sort of read the kids, and kids can sort of play off each other and how other kids may be reacting. They may feel like they need to react in the same sort of way. And there's sort of mixed results on mixed research about whether we want to have kids, processing in a group setting about something that's happened. On the one hand, it could be really helpful for kids to know that they're not isolated. I think that's a good rule of thumb, is to kind of start with that approach. But as some kids may be struggling. That might affect them even more when they see, maybe one child has been more affected than the other, and that child doesn't really need to participate in the group discussion of what happened. Hopefully there are some mental health professionals who are on staff or who could be accessed to help out a school or child care center following an event. But kids, want to do something. They may feel powerless. So having them draw about what happened, write about what happened, think about ways to solve a problem that they may see as the cause of all of these violent events. Problem solve, brainstorm, think about it together as a class, and then again, just watch for those kids who are struggling even more, having setbacks in their school progress, and refer them for more services.
I guess my final question would be back to when you were talking about sometimes children will just play out what they're seeing. In in a home situation, it's a little bit easier to let that play out a little bit longer. But in a classroom setting, oftentimes schools will have rules about no weapons and no battle play or things like that. So, but it is an important thing for children to be able to play that out. So how long do you let that go before you intervene?
Yeah. So how long do we let play about a particular event go before we intervene as teachers or child care providers? Given the limits that lots of settings have on what type of play is acceptable. So this is a wonderful question. I love this question. Because kids who don't have access to toy guns, for example, but have that on their mind, and they again are driven to play out these events because they're affected by them or may have PTSD, they're going to take up any object and pretend it's gun or a weapon or whatever they want to use to tell a story. So what we can do, when we're worried about this or we don't, think it's gone on a little too long, again, it may be a sign that it's really on the child's mind. We want to get them help. We want to let the parents know. We want to get, any mental health professionals on board. And in terms of intervening, it's so important for kids to be able to tell their story, if it's possible, and say, this is a really important story that you're sharing with me. I want to hear more about this. I'm going to, but right now is not the time. Right now, we're going to move on to something else, but I really want to hear more about that another time. Or I may ask Miss So-and-so to come and talk with you a little more or play with you about that.
That's a great question. I'm also hearing this added responsibility on educators and caregivers. So I'm going back to your PRN for teachers as well, to teachers to remember that they need to pause, reflect, and nourish, right?
Yes.
Because that's one more thing that it's like, okay, now I need to be looking for these signals. Right. I think that's all we have for today. Are there any questions from the?
That was it. I think we covered it.
Thank you. And Dialogue Director Holly Delferez. Thank you so much for being here today. I learned a lot, and I always feel so calm when you give us these direct answers that we can use for our toolbox when we're working with parents and caregivers here as well. And we'll see you again for our next In Dialogue session.
Great.
Thank you so much. Thank you.